My fiancé tried to turn my wedding into my biggest humiliation. It destroyed his future instead. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and until the morning of my wedding, I believed I knew exactly who Ethan Carter was. We'd spent 4 years together and been engaged for the last 18 months. We talked about buying a house, having children someday, hosting Sunday dinners for our families, and saving enough money to explore places neither of us had ever seen. It wasn't a glamorous dream, but it felt like ours. Looking back, I realize I spent those 4 years loving two different versions of the same man. One was the Ethan everyone admired, kind, funny, dependable, and somehow able to make me laugh before an argument ever became serious. The other was the Ethan I kept explaining away. I was obsessed with social media. Instagram, TikTok, reaction videos, lifestyle clips, anything that might catch people's attention. He only had around 15,000 followers, but to him, every ordinary moment carried the potential to become a viral video if it was filmed the right way. At first, I thought it was harmless. Everyone has hobbies. Mine was woodworking. His just happened to involve a camera. So when he asked me to fake a surprised reaction because he hadn't recorded the first one, I smiled and did it again. When dinner went cold because he wanted a better overhead shot, I reheated it without complaining. Even after we'd settled an argument, he'd sometimes ask if we could recreate the conversation because, as he liked to say, real emotion performs better. I laughed every time. I wish I hadn't. The warning signs became impossible to ignore during our engagement photo shoot. Ethan insisted on repeating the same walk beneath a row of maple trees 6 times because the sunlight wasn't hitting his face the way he wanted. By the final attempt, my feet were aching, my smile had turned stiff, and even the photographer had stopped pretending he wasn't irritated. When Ethan looked through the photos, he frowned. "These don't feel spontaneous." I couldn't help laughing. "We've walked past the same tree 6 times. That's not the point." "Then what is?" He barely looked up from the camera screen. "It has to look effortless." That single sentence explained more about Ethan than I understood at the time. He wasn't interested in preserving real moments. He wanted to manufacture moments that looked real, then convince everyone, including himself, that the performance mattered more than the truth. By the time our wedding day arrived, 120 guests had gathered to celebrate with us. Between our families and our own savings, we'd spent nearly $47,000, including the $22,000 I'd spent years saving from every paycheck. Ethan's parents covered the venue and catering, while mine paid for our honeymoon. Every detail had been planned down to the last flower, from the photographer and DJ to the open bar and the 3-tier cake Ethan had spent weeks designing with the baker. I wanted everything elegant but modern, often reminding vendors, nothing too traditional. It has to look good on camera. I told myself that was normal. Most couples wanted beautiful wedding photos, but Ethan cared less about experiencing the day than how it would look after it was uploaded online. I noticed the difference, yet never questioned why it bothered me. Standing in the bridal suite that morning, adjusting my dress in front of the mirror, I honestly believed every sacrifice had been worth it. I had no idea Ethan had already decided our wedding wasn't going to be remembered as a marriage. It was going to be another performance. Sunlight filled the room as my mother fastened the last button on my dress. Mia Reynolds, my best friend, stood nearby holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. After watching me for a moment, she asked quietly, "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I am." She studied my face before lowering her voice. "I just don't want today to become more about Ethan than the two of you." "What do you mean?" "He's been directing everyone since 7 this morning. He had the florist move the arch twice because it didn't look right in the live stream, and he told the photographer not to take any candid shots unless he approved the angle first." I shrugged, trying to smile. "He's just nervous." "I hope that's all it is." Her answer lingered in my mind longer than I expected, but before I could ask anything else, my mother turned toward me with tears in her eyes. "It's time." I took one last look at myself in the mirror. The dress fit perfectly. My grandmother's earrings caught the morning light, and for a brief moment, I saw exactly what every bride hopes to see, a future waiting just beyond those ceremony doors. Whatever uneasiness Mia had stirred faded as the music began, and I walked toward the aisle believing I was about to marry the man I'd loved for 4 years. My father offered me his arm and smiled. "You can still run." I laughed. "You're supposed to reassure me." "I'm your father," he said. "Giving you options is part of the job." When the doors opened, 120 guests rose to their feet. Ethan stood beneath the floral arch waiting for me, his eyes already shining with tears. For once, he wasn't watching a camera or worrying about the perfect angle. He was looking only at me, and seeing him there erased every doubt I'd carried into that room. My father kissed my cheek before placing my hand in Ethan's. "You look incredible," Ethan whispered. "So do you." His hands were cold. "Nervous?" "A little." "Me too." The ceremony began with a few readings, light-hearted stories from our families, and vows we'd written ourselves. Ethan spoke first, recalling the night we met, our first apartment, and how I'd taught him that love could feel steady instead of dramatic. "You make me want to become a better man," he said. "Not for anyone else, just for you." Tears filled my eyes. I believed every word. When it was my turn, I promised to stand beside him through every challenge life could bring. I meant every promise I made. Mr. Harold Whitmore smiled before asking the question we'd waited 18 months to hear. "Claire Bennett, do you take Ethan Carter to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Then he turned to Ethan. "Ethan Carter, do you take Claire Bennett to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Ethan didn't answer. At first, I thought he was overwhelmed with emotion. Then I felt his grip loosen, and instead of looking at me, his eyes drifted toward the front row. I followed his gaze. Tyler, his best man, was holding up his phone. 2 other friends were doing the same. All 3 cameras pointed directly at us. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "No!" The word echoed through the room. No one moved. Even the music seemed to disappear. Mr. Whitmore frowned. "I'm sorry?" "I said no," Ethan repeated with a laugh. I searched his face for panic, regret, anything that would make sense of what I just heard. Instead, he glanced towards Tyler's phone again. That was when everything clicked. The cameras, the smile, the timing. This wasn't cold feet. It wasn't fear. It was a performance. Ethan laughed harder and waved a hand. "Relax. It's just a TikTok prank. I say no, everyone freaks out, then I say yes." Before anyone could react, Mr. Whitmore quietly closed the ceremony book. "If you aren't prepared to treat these vows seriously," he said, "I cannot continue this wedding." The color drained from Ethan's face. "Wait, I'm serious. You just refused the marriage. It was only a joke." "The vows are not a stage for jokes." Ethan turned to me with the same desperate look I'd seen every time one of his plans fell apart. "Claire, tell him." I couldn't. Behind him, Tyler slowly lowered his phone while Ethan reached for my hand again. "Come on," he pleaded. "You're treating one mistake like a tragedy." Maybe it had, but those 2 seconds had shattered everything we'd spent 4 years building. I looked across the room. My mother had gone pale. My father was already on his feet. Ethan's parents looked completely stunned, and Mia never took her eyes off me. In that instant, every memory I dismissed suddenly fit together. The engagement photos we repeated until they looked natural, the conversations Ethan wanted to recreate for the camera, and his favorite excuse whenever I questioned any of it. Real emotion performs better. Only then did I understand the truth. Ethan hadn't acted on impulse. He had planned every second of this moment, and so had the friends holding cameras around the room. Everyone knew what was about to happen except the woman standing across from him in a wedding dress. I stepped away from the altar without saying a word. Ethan hurried after me. "Claire, don't be dramatic." That was the last thing I needed to hear. Ignoring him, I walked straight to the DJ booth while he kept calling my name behind me. The room turned to watch as I held out my hand. "I need the microphone." The DJ hesitated for only a second before placing it in my hand. When I faced the room, 120 guests were waiting in complete silence. Ethan remained beneath the wedding arch, still convinced I would somehow rescue the disaster he'd created. "My name is Claire Bennett," I began, my voice far steadier than I felt. "A few minutes ago, Ethan decided our wedding vows would make great TikTok content. His plan was simple: say no, wait for everyone to panic, then reveal it was all a prank. The only people who weren't told were me and the man officiating our wedding." A wave of disbelief swept through the room as guests turned toward Mr. Harold Whitmore, who still stood quietly with the closed ceremony book in his hands. "As you've all seen, Mr. Whitmore refused to continue because my fiancé chose to treat our marriage like entertainment." "It was just a joke," Ethan interrupted as he walked toward me. "Give me the microphone." I shook my head. "You think this only went too far after it backfired? It was supposed to last 2 seconds. Then why were Tyler and your friends recording from 3 different angles?" Ethan had no answer. Neither did Tyler, who slowly lowered his phone without meeting my eyes. I took a slow breath and looked back at our guests. The food has already been paid for. The venue is ours until midnight, and the bar is still open. I'm not letting $47,000 and all of you go to waste. A few nervous laughs broke the silence. "So the wedding is officially cancelled." I paused just long enough for the words to sink in. "But the reception isn't." The room stayed quiet. "Please stay, eat, drink, dance, and enjoy the evening. If there's no wedding anymore, then tonight is simply a celebration of everyone who showed up in good faith." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone started clapping. Another guest joined in. Within seconds, the applause spread across the ballroom, not because the day had been saved, but because everyone finally understood who had ruined it, and it wasn't me. Ethan's face went pale. "What are you doing?" saving the only part of today that's still worth saving. He reached for the microphone, but I stepped back before he could touch it. You don't get to decide that. I already did. You embarrassed me. I almost laughed. No, Ethan. You embarrassed yourself the moment you expected me to be the only person in this room who didn't know about your prank. He tried to defend himself again. It was only supposed to last 2 seconds. Then why were Tyler and your friends recording from 3 different angles? Silence answered for him. Tyler finally spoke. You told us she'd laugh, and you said the officiant knew. I most certainly did not, Mr. Whitmore interrupted. Every head turned toward him as he calmly adjusted his glasses. In 34 years of officiating weddings, I've never seen anyone treat marriage vows as entertainment. This ceremony is over. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment. Ethan buried his face in his hands. This can't be happening. It already did. Mia quietly slipped beside me and squeezed my arm. You don't have to protect him anymore. Her words hit harder than anything else I'd heard that day. She was right. I'd spent years defending Ethan, excusing the constant filming, the obsession with comments, and the way every vacation or meaningful conversation somehow became another opportunity for a camera. Every time someone questioned him, I defended him. Every time something felt wrong, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I suddenly wondered how many times I'd apologized for problems he'd created. Desperate, Ethan looked around the room. Can somebody please tell her she's being ridiculous? No one answered. Instead, his father slowly walked toward us. Claire, I'm so sorry. Richard looked devastated, but before I could respond, Ethan cut him off. Dad, you're apologizing to her? Richard turned to his son. You humiliated this young woman in front of everyone we know. It was for a video. Richard closed his eyes. I don't even recognize you anymore. Diane immediately stepped in. This whole thing would have been fine if the officiant hadn't overreacted. Mr. Whitmore remained composed. Ma'am, I simply respected vows your son chose not to. It only lasted 2 seconds. A guest near the bar muttered, so does pulling the pin on a grenade. Laughter rippled through the ballroom, and Ethan's expression hardened. Tell everyone this isn't over. Oh, it isn't, I replied, turning toward the DJ. In fact, it's just getting started. He gave me a cautious smile. What would you like me to play? I glanced around the room. Guests were still frozen between shock and uncertainty, waiting for someone to decide how this day would end. Something people can dance to. The music started, and after a few awkward moments, my father walked onto the dance floor and held out his hand to my mother. She laughed through her tears and joined him, breaking the tension that had paralyzed the room. Conversations returned, drinks were poured, appetizers appeared, and little by little our guests reclaimed the celebration Ethan had tried to ruin. He stared at them in disbelief. You can't seriously be celebrating. We're celebrating the fact that I learned the truth before I signed a marriage certificate. His face tightened with anger. You'll regret this. I already regret trusting you. Without warning, he lunged toward the DJ booth and ripped at one of the sound cables. If there's no wedding, nobody gets a party. The music cut off instantly. Before anyone else could react, the venue manager and 2 security guards rushed over. Ethan, let go. No? Then you'll have to leave. He laughed bitterly. You can't throw me out of my own wedding. One of the guards met his eyes. There isn't a wedding anymore. For several long seconds, Ethan stood there, breathing hard. Finally, he let go of the cable, turned, and walked out without another word. Diane hurried after him, while Richard paused only long enough to whisper another quiet apology before following his family. As the ballroom doors closed, the music started again. Relief washed over me so suddenly my knees almost gave out. Mia squeezed my shoulder. You don't have to be strong forever. I know. You can fall apart later. I probably will. But not because of him. Across the room, servers wheeled out the wedding cake Ethan had spent weeks designing. It was beautiful, almost painfully so, and for a moment I wondered how something so carefully planned had ended so completely differently. Tyler approached me one last time. I don't expect you to forgive me. You shouldn't. I honestly believed he'd say yes right away. You still agreed to help him. He lowered his head. I know. Tyler didn't ask for forgiveness again. He simply nodded once and walked away. The DJ picked up the microphone with an awkward smile. I think the bride deserves the first slice of cake. Laughter rippled through the ballroom, and someone shouted, Absolutely! I hesitated only briefly before cutting into the cake. It wasn't the celebration I'd imagined, but somehow it still belonged to me. Through the ballroom windows, I caught one last glimpse of Ethan sitting alone on the front steps with his head in his hands. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't go after him. Less than 12 hours later, the story reached TikTok. Mia called before I'd even gotten out of my pajamas. Don't open social media. What happened? Tyler uploaded the prank. I opened TikTok anyway. The video was titled "Wedding Prank Gone Wrong" and already had nearly 50,000 views. It showed Ethan smiling at the altar, saying "no," my stunned expression, and the officiant's reaction before cutting off completely. Everything that happened afterward, the microphone, the cancelled ceremony, the reception, even Ethan trying to stop the party, had been removed. The comments were brutal. "She can't take a joke." He dodged a lifetime of drama. "Best prank ever." I locked my phone and leaned back against the wall. "They cut everything." "I know," Mia said quietly, "but don't waste your energy arguing with strangers." I agreed, though it didn't stop the apartment from feeling painfully empty. Wedding gifts sat unopened, decorations were stacked in boxes, and my dress still hung in the spare room like evidence from another life. Around noon, my cousin Emma called. "Check TikTok again." This time the comments looked completely different. Someone who had attended the wedding wrote, "That's not what happened." Another guest uploaded the full ceremony. Someone else shared Ethan trying to grab the microphone. Another posted the officiant refusing to continue, and another captured security stepping in after Ethan tried to shut down the music. Within hours, the edited prank was buried beneath the truth. Han planned this. The bride didn't overreact. Han humiliated her for views as, "This isn't funny anymore." By that evening, Tyler had deleted the original upload, but it no longer mattered. Guests had reposted the videos across multiple platforms. Larger accounts picked them up, and within days, the story had spread far beyond Ethan's own audience. For the first time since the wedding, I could finally breathe, not because strangers defended me, but because the people who had actually been there had spoken. 2 days later, an unknown number appeared on my phone. "Claire!" I recognized Diane Carter's voice immediately. "I've been trying to reach you. I blocked your number." I called from work. "What do you want?" "You owe my son an apology." I almost laughed. "Your son said no at the altar." It was a joke. The officiant didn't think so. He overreacted. No, he refused to marry a man who treated his vows like a TikTok stunt. Diane's voice hardened. "My husband and I spent thousands of dollars on that wedding." "So did I." "You turned it into a circus." "I turned it into the only part of the day our guests could still enjoy." "You embarrassed Ethan." "No," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Ethan embarrassed himself." "So we've spoken to a lawyer," Diane said at last. "So have I." That wasn't true, not yet, but she didn't need to know that. "You'll be hearing from us." "I'll be waiting." The moment the call ended, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney. If Ethan's family wanted to turn this into a legal fight, I wasn't going to face it unprepared. That Saturday morning, another knock echoed through my apartment. Through the peephole, I found Ethan standing outside with 2 storage boxes in his arms. "I brought your things." For a second, I almost left him there. Instead, I opened the door just far enough to take the boxes before stepping into the hallway behind me. "You have 5 minutes." I looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't shaved in days, and he was still wearing the leather jacket he'd worn on our first date. For one brief, dangerous moment, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him. Then I remembered the altar. "I've been trying to explain," he said. "You've been trying to justify." He let out a slow breath. I panicked. "You don't panic by arranging 3 cameras." I wanted everyone to laugh. Everyone except the woman in the wedding dress. "I thought you'd laugh too." "You still don't understand, do you?" He frowned, confused. "There it is again." "What?" "You keep measuring time." "I'm measuring trust." He stared at me. "I spent 4 years believing you would protect me. You destroyed that trust in 2 seconds." For the first time, he had no answer. Instead, he reached for another excuse. "My therapist thinks I have commitment anxiety." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So your solution was to humiliate me in front of everyone we know?" "I never wanted to hurt you." "Then what exactly were you trying to do?" He hesitated before finally admitting the truth. "I wanted a wedding people would never forget." I gave a hollow laugh. "Congratulations, you got one." Hum flinched, but I wasn't finished. "Answer one question honestly. If the officiant hadn't stopped the ceremony, would you have uploaded the video?" He hesitated only a moment. Probably." That single word ended every doubt I still had. Han wasn't sorry for humiliating me. He was sorry his plan had failed. Everything suddenly became simple. "This was never about us," I said. "Your audience mattered more than your bride. I love you." "You loved my reaction." "Claire, we can fix this." "No, Ethan. People make mistakes by accident. What you did was a choice." His shoulders slowly sagged. "You'd really throw away 4 years." I met his eyes without raising my voice. "You threw them away before I ever picked up that microphone." He stood there for another moment, searching for something to say. but neither of us believed there were any words left that could change what had happened. Eventually, he picked up the empty boxes and walked away without looking back. 3 weeks later, an envelope from a law firm arrived in my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was another wedding vendor sending paperwork, but the return address belonged to an attorney representing Ethan's parents. I read the letter twice before it finally sank in. Ethan's parents were demanding $18,000, claiming I'd caused them emotional distress, hijacked the reception for my own benefit, and financially damaged their family by refusing to continue the ceremony. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so detached from reality that I didn't know how else to react. Mia, who was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, reached for the letter and scanned it in silence. "They're actually blaming you for refusing to pretend none of it happened." She looked up. "You're not seriously thinking about paying them, are you?" "No, I'm calling a lawyer." 2 days later, I met with Rebecca Lawson, who listened patiently as I walked her through everything, from Ethan's obsession with filming every important moment to the officiant refusing to continue the ceremony. When I finished, she asked for every piece of evidence I had. Guest videos, screenshots, messages, bank records, and photos disappeared into her file while she reviewed them one by one. Finally, she leaned back and smiled. "The good news is they don't have much of a case. And the bad news? They're hoping you'll panic and pay to avoid a lawsuit." "So what do we do?" "We remind them the facts are on your side." Over the next week, we built a response that was impossible to ignore. Mr. Harold Whitmore provided a written statement explaining why he ended the ceremony. Several guests submitted unedited videos from different angles. The venue manager documented Ethan trying to shut down the reception, and my bank records confirmed I'd personally contributed $22,000 to the wedding. Rebecca finished the packet with a notice that if Ethan's family insisted on suing, we were prepared to counterclaim for the financial losses caused by Ethan's own actions. "If they really want to stand in front of a judge," she said, "they'll have to explain why the groom publicly refused to marry the bride as part of an online stunt." "What do you think they'll do?" "My guess, they'll get very quiet." She was right. Almost a week passed without another threat, and I started believing the worst was finally behind me. Then an Instagram message appeared from someone I didn't recognize. "Olivia Hayes. You don't know me. I'm Ethan's ex. We should talk." I almost ignored it until her next message arrived. "What happened to you wasn't the first time. We met the following afternoon at a small coffee shop. I saw the wedding online," Olivia said quietly. "I'm sorry, not for what happened, but because I recognized it immediately." "What do you mean?" She gave me a tired smile. "Years ago, Ethan pretended to break up with me in front of all my friends so he could record everyone's reaction. Back then it was for Vine." I stared at her. "He said it would only last a few seconds." The words hit me like a punch. They were almost identical to what he'd told me at the altar. "I cried," she continued. "He laughed, told everyone it was just another video, and acted like I was the one who couldn't take a joke. For the first time, I stopped seeing my wedding as an isolated disaster. It wasn't. It was a pattern." Olivia described birthdays interrupted by cameras, vacations that felt more like photo shoots than holidays, and arguments Ethan insisted on recreating because the first reaction hadn't been dramatic enough. As she spoke, memories I'd spent years dismissing suddenly fit together. "I kept waiting for him to grow out of it," she admitted. "So did I." When we stood to leave, she hesitated. "There's one more thing. Someone I know still talks to Ethan." I felt my stomach tighten. "He's telling people the wedding made him famous. He's already pitching himself to brands, convinced they'll want to work with him because everyone knows his story." I shook my head. "You mean my story?" Olivia nodded. "Exactly." 2 days later, Olivia's warning proved true. Anna's email arrived from Stephanie, a digital marketing consultant who had attended the wedding as the guest of one of Ethan's cousins. Attached were several screenshots showing Ethan pitching himself to companies that produced wedding and relationship content. In his messages, he described himself as the victim of a wedding disaster that had gone viral and offered interviews, sponsorships, and brand partnerships built around the story. The wedding hadn't even been over for a month. Weeks before Rebecca would eventually tell me the legal dispute was over, Ethan was already trying to profit from what he'd done. I forwarded everything to Rebecca. At that point, Ethan's family's legal claim was still unresolved, so anything showing he was trying to profit from the incident could become important if the dispute ended up in court. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. "Keep every screenshot," she said. "Don't contact him, and don't let him know we've seen any of this. If the lawsuit moves forward, these messages could become very useful." That same evening, Ethan's father called. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "I've read the lawyer's response," Richard said quietly. "My wife still believes we're doing the right thing." "And you?" After a long silence, he admitted, "No." For the first time since the wedding, someone from Ethan's family wasn't trying to defend him. I know he made a terrible mistake, Richard continued. I also know both of you are hurting. Can we find a way to end this before it gets worse? I let the silence hang between us before answering. I didn't start this, Richard. Your family did. If you withdraw the claim, there's nothing left for me to fight. I'll talk to Diane. Before ending the call, he hesitated. He really did love you. I looked out the apartment window, remembering the smile on Ethan's face just before he said no. Maybe he did, I replied. But he loved having an audience even more. The line went quiet. When the call ended, I realized something I'd been unwilling to admit since the wedding. None of this had ever been about a harmless prank. It was about what Ethan valued most, and he'd revealed that long before we reached the altar. 2 months later, Rebecca finally called with the news I'd been waiting for. They dropped it. I looked up from the half-finished bookshelf in my garage. The lawsuit. Completely. No settlement, no appeal. My guess is their attorney finally watched the full videos and realized exactly how this would look in court. A long breath escaped me. So it's finally over. As far as the legal side is concerned, yes. If Ethan or anyone in his family contacts you again, let me know. Otherwise, it's time to move on. When the call ended, I stood alone in the garage, listening to the silence. For weeks, every knock at my door and every unknown number had felt like the beginning of another fight. For the first time since the wedding, it felt like the fighting was finally over, even if the financial damage remained. Nearly $47,000 had disappeared in less than an hour, and much of it was gone for good. Still, a few unexpected acts of kindness reminded me that not everyone measured life by money. The venue manager called first. I've been thinking about what happened, he said. Your venue credit is transferable. A week later, I sold it to a co-worker who was planning his own wedding and recovered $3,500. It barely dented the loss, but it reminded me that even after the worst days, life sometimes finds small ways to give something back. Soon after, the photographer reached out and offered me a complimentary portrait session as a fresh start. I thanked him but declined, asking instead if he would use it for my younger sister Emma, who had recently gotten engaged. He agreed immediately, and that simple conversation made me smile for the first time in weeks. Then an email arrived with the subject line, podcast invitation. A producer explained that several guests had shared the full wedding videos and wanted me to appear on an episode about social media and modern weddings. They had invited Ethan as well and hoped to hear both sides. My first instinct was to refuse. I don't want to become part of the circus, I admitted to Mia over dinner. She shook her head. They already know what happened at the wedding. They don't know who you are. She was right. I agreed to the interview after one condition. I could review my direct quotes before publication. For nearly 90 minutes, we talked about trust, boundaries, and the moment I realized approval from strangers had become more important to Ethan than protecting the people closest to him. The interviewer eventually asked the question I expected least. If you could go back, would you change what happened at the altar? I thought about it before answering. No, she looked surprised. If Ethan had waited until after we were legally married to show me who he really was, leaving would have been a lot harder. That answer stayed with me long after the interview ended. Walking back to my car, I realized I wasn't speaking to protect Ethan anymore. I was finally telling the truth without worrying how it would affect him. A week later, the producer emailed again. Ethan had declined to participate after learning I'd already completed my interview. The episode wasn't a viral sensation, but it didn't need to be. Anyone who listened heard the full story instead of a carefully edited 15-second clip. Within days, the episode had begun circulating through the wedding and digital marketing industry, including companies Ethan had already approached for sponsorships. A few days after it aired, my phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't expected. Daniel Carter, Ethan's older brother. Unlike the rest of Ethan's family, Daniel had never asked me to forgive his brother. His message was brief. Thought you should know, the partnership fell through. When I called, he explained that the company had listened to the podcast, watched the unedited wedding videos, and immediately backed out. They said they don't work with creators who manufacture public humiliation. There was a long silence before Daniel sighed. He's devastated. I'm sorry to hear that. I am too, he admitted. But Claire, he did this to himself. When the call ended, I realized nobody was trying to convince me to take Ethan back anymore. Even the people who loved him couldn't defend what he'd done. Life gradually settled into something I hadn't experienced in years, peace. Therapy helped me understand that betrayal doesn't disappear when a relationship ends. It lingers until you stop blaming yourself for someone else's choices. During one session, my therapist asked, "When was the first time you ignored your instincts?" "The engagement photos," I answered without thinking. I told her about walking past the same tree 6 times because Ethan wanted the perfect shot, apologizing to the photographer instead of questioning Ethan, and convincing myself I was being unreasonable for wanting the moment to feel real instead of staged. She smiled gently. So the wedding didn't start the problem. It exposed it. That sentence stayed with me. I stopped trying to rebuild the life I'd lost and started building one that actually felt like mine. The wedding decorations disappeared, the apartment was rearranged, the bedroom repainted, and the garage slowly filled with woodworking projects again. One afternoon, Mia ran her hand across an uneven bookshelf I'd been building and laughed. "It isn't perfect." I smiled. "I know, that's finally the point. For years, I'd chased flawless pictures, carefully staged vacations, and moments designed to impress strangers. Somehow this crooked bookshelf brought me more peace than any of them ever had. A few days later, I found my engagement ring while cleaning out a drawer. Holding it brought back two memories at once. Ethan's proposal and the smile on his face just before he said no at the altar. I slipped it back into the box without anger, only acceptance. Moments later, my laptop chimed. The email was from Ethan. "Can we talk like adults?" I opened it, hoping to find accountability. Instead, I found excuses, anxiety, pressure, misunderstandings. By the fourth paragraph, he was explaining how I'd embarrassed him by refusing to go along with the prank. I closed the email before reaching the end. By the fourth paragraph, I understood exactly what I was reading. This wasn't an apology. I wasn't taking responsibility. He simply wanted the life he'd lost back. I deleted the message without replying, and for the first time since the wedding, stopped leaving the door cracked open for someone who had already walked away. The weeks that followed were wonderfully ordinary. Breakfast wasn't interrupted by cameras, conversations weren't repeated because the lighting had changed, and silence no longer felt empty. One morning, Mia found me sanding the same crooked bookshelf. "I haven't seen you this relaxed in years." I forgot what normal felt like. "You spent so much energy trying to make him happy." I thought that's what love was. "And now?" I brushed the sawdust from my hands and smiled. "I think love should feel peaceful, not exhausting." Therapy eventually stopped being about Ethan altogether. One afternoon, my therapist asked, if he had said yes at the altar, would you still have married him? "Yes," I answered instinctively. Then I stopped. The certainty disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. I loved him, I admitted, but I also ignored far too much. What changed? I thought about it for a long moment. I stopped confusing peace with boredom. She smiled. "And how does that feel?" "Lighter." I finally understood that I hadn't lost the right future. I'd escaped the wrong one. About a month later, Olivia invited me to lunch. She looked happier than the first time we'd met. "I started seeing someone." "Really?" She laughed. "He barely looks at his phone." We both smiled before she grew serious again. I spent years believing I wasn't enough for Ethan. I kept thinking if I'd been more supportive or more exciting, he'd stop chasing attention. She shook her head. "But people like him don't change because someone loves them enough. They only change if they decide to." Olivia was right. A few weeks later, Tyler showed up at my apartment carrying a handwritten letter. Before I could invite him in, he quietly admitted I should have stopped him. "You should have." He nodded without arguing. I knew it was a stupid idea. I just kept telling myself he'd lose his nerve. And when he didn't, Tyler looked down. I chose to say nothing. That answer mattered more than any excuse. He wasn't asking me to forgive him or pretending he hadn't played a part. He simply accepted responsibility. "I hope you never make that choice again." "I won't." I left without another word, and I never saw him again. By autumn, the apartment finally felt like mine instead of ours. The wedding decorations were gone, the last unopened gifts had been donated, and fresh paint covered the bedroom walls. While clearing out a drawer, I found my engagement ring again. This time I didn't put it back. I carried it to a local jeweler who examined it before asking, "What would you like me to make?" I smiled. "Something that has nothing to do with a wedding." A few weeks later, she handed me a simple silver pendant with the same diamond set in its center. It no longer looked like an engagement ring, and that was exactly the point. It wasn't a reminder of Ethan anymore. It reminded me that even broken promises could become something meaningful without pretending they had never existed. Around the same time, Daniel sent one final message. I moved away. There was nothing else. No explanation, no apology, no request. I wished him well, deleted the conversation, and realized every thread connecting me to Ethan had quietly disappeared. I hadn't forced myself to let go. Life had simply kept moving, and eventually I moved with it. People still ask about the wedding from time to time. Almost everyone ends with the same question. If you could go back, would you stop him? My answer has never changed. No. They usually expect regret, so I explain. If he hadn't shown me exactly who he was before we signed the marriage certificate, I might have spent years defending someone who never deserved it. I would have mistaken silence for love and convinced myself that accepting less was the price of keeping a relationship. Looking back, I no longer think of my wedding as the worst day of my life. It was simply the day everything finally made sense. When I think back now, I don't remember Ethan saying no before anything else. I remember the guests who stayed, my parents dancing anyway, the bartender quietly handing me a glass of champagne, and a room full of people refusing to let one man's selfishness define the day. Oddly enough, I even remember the cake. People laugh when I say it, but it really was the best wedding cake I'd ever tasted. Maybe because every bite reminded me that losing the wrong future had made room for the right one. Looking back, I realize I only had two choices that afternoon. Keep protecting the man who had humiliated me, or finally protect myself. For 4 years, I always chose him. That day, I finally chose me.